afternoon, everyone. It's time for Mrs. Blue Reads, and today we're finishing up Poppy by Avi, illustrated by Brian Floca and published by Orchard Books. And remember, Poppy got to the new house and she kind of figured out why Mr. O'Cox didn't want them to go there. And now she's on her way back home and she's still got to try to figure out how to get that salt lick for the porcupine for Orath. Chapter 17, a surprising conversation. Poppy woke refreshed. For a moment, she just lay there, luxuriating in her discoveries. She imagined telling her family what a phony Mr. O'Cox was. What a delicious moment. Yes, it was time to return home. Realizing that she was very hungry, Poppy first treated herself to a big meal, eating all the plumpest corn kernels. Hadn't she deserved them? Gradually, she ate her way over to the dirt road that ran alongside the dim wood forest. With her mouth full and her belly tight, she gazed across at the wall of pine and fir. She had feared it before. Now, knowing it, she recalled only its dark beauty, its deep fascination. The forest made her think of Aerith and her promise. How was she going to get him the salt? She still had no idea, and there she vowed that once she got home, she would return, maybe this time with Cousin Basil. Perhaps the two of them could find a way. Poppy thought about Mr. O'Cox, too. Wouldn't it be fun to tell him what she had discovered? The image of it made her grin. The liar! The bully! It was while she was thinking about him that she spied him. Mr. O'Cox was perched deep within the foliage on a small tree right by the edge of the forest. If it had not been for the slanting rays of the sun, Poppy might never have noticed. Poppy crept forward. When she came near the row of corn closest to the forest, she looked up again. A moody Mr. O'Cox was staring at the barn across the field. He kept moving his head about, back, forward, side to side, hissing and clacking his beak. Sometimes his black talons kneaded the branch with nervous tension. At other times he ruffled his feathers, lifted his wings, let his head sink lower. Poppy could tell he was miserable, sulking. She had to marvel at how different he appeared from the time she had seen him on his watching tree in the rain, all that glaring and hissing. He's just a frightened bully, she said to herself with jubilation. She had to slap a paw over her mouth to keep from laughing out loud. What fun it would be to humiliate him. Just the idea of it brought a feeling of power. Unable to resist teasing him, she called out, "Mr. O'Cox!" The owl, taken by surprise, looked up, down, around. "Here," Poppy cried, "in the corn, it's me, Poppy." Mr. O'Cox hunched over and peered in her general direction. "Show yourself," he said harshly. "I'll stay where I am, thank you," Poppy returned. Wedged in as she was among the cornstalks, she felt totally secure. She knew he could not reach her there. "Mr. O'Cox," she called, "is it the owl on that barn that you're looking at?" "What's it to you?" he growled. "You're frightened of it, aren't you?" Poppy said. Mr. O'Cox opened his beak, but no sound came out. Instead, he kept peering into the corn. Poppy said, "It's awful to be frightened, isn't it?" "What did you say?" "I said it's not fun being frightened, is it?" To this, Mr. O'Cox said nothing. "I could tell you a little something about that owl," Poppy called, feeling altogether giddy with her knowledge. "What is that something?" the owl asked. "Want to talk about it?" Poppy offered, suppressing a giggle. "Well, I might as well say it to you. I'm going to tell my family." Mr. O'Cox shifted uncomfortably on his perch. "I'll talk," he said. Then he added, "but we could talk more easily if I could see you." Poppy's ears, the owl's tone had shifted. It was not nearly so hostile as it had been. Was she only imagining that? Should she trust him? But even as she asked herself that question, she thought, "Oh, the look on his face when I tell him that the bird he's so frightened of is nothing but a fake." Aloud, she called, "Would you really like to talk about it with me?" "Yes, I would," replied Mr. O'Cox. "You seem to be a very smart mouse." Poppy blushed. No one had ever called her smart before. This, she had to admit, was a very different side of Mr. O'Cox from what she had known. Ragweed, in his way, had challenged him. As for her father, he had been very timid in his approach. Perhaps the owl would respect someone who stood up to him politely but firmly. "Do you really think I'm smart?" she inquired. "I certainly do," the owl said. "Yes, perhaps the two of us should just sit down and talk. The two smart ones. Maybe we could work something out." Poppy felt a stirring of excitement. Here she was, Poppy, talking in a perfectly reasonable way with the great Mr. O'Cox. It was she, with her new knowledge, who had gained power. Perhaps instead of humiliating him, she could work things out reasonably so the mice could move to new house. Wouldn't that be a trophy to bring home? So thinking, she moved from her hiding place a little onto the dirt road. Yes, Mr. O'Cox said soothingly. Let the two of us talk things over. I should think we could find some reasonable solutions. All right, said Poppy. Boldly, she stepped farther out onto the road. She looked up. Mr. O'Cox was gone. There she is. Where are you? She cried. At that moment, the owl plunged down upon her from behind. Chapter 18, The Battle. Ragweed's earrings saved her. So powerful, so swift was Mr. O'Cox's descent that he pushed a wave of air before him and caused the earring to flutter. The flutter felt like the tap of a tiny finger on Poppy's ear. She felt it and whirled. At the last possible second, she saw the owl coming and made a leap to safety. The next moment, however, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. She had leaped, not back among the corn, but farther onto the open road. Mr. O'Cox was now on the ground, blocking her way to the field. She spun toward the forest. In a second, the owl was up in the air and down on the other side. Once again, he had blocked her way. Not so smart as all that, are you? He sneered. Well, I don't compromise with what I want, he told her. And what I want is you never getting home alive. He made a sudden darting movement to the left. Poppy jumped to the right, but Mr. O'Cox was ahead of her. Just as quickly, he shifted back toward her, so that Poppy was forced to halt herself clumsily. There she stood, flat-footed, panting, not sure which way to go. The owl, towering over her, laughed. I told you what would happen if I caught up with you again, didn't I? But this time you won't have that fat porcupine to help you. So saying, he made a snap at her with his beak. Mr. O'Cox's mention of Aerith was the reminder Poppy needed. She reached down and yanked the quill from her sash, then held it before her like a sword. At first, Mr. O'Cox blinked. Then he snickered. You don't think one of his quills is going to stop me, do you? That owl on the barn, Poppy panted between hard breathing, is just a fake. You've been frightened by a fake owl. Mr. O'Cox's beak dropped open. He hesitated. In that moment, Poppy sensed she could have gotten away, but she could not resist another taunt. You're not an owl, you're a chicken, she cried in triumph. For an instant, the two of them, owl and mouse, confronted each other. Then a look of terrible rage passed across the owl's face. Poppy knew then that she'd made another blunder. She'd lost her momentary chance of escape. Now there was nothing he'd not do to kill her. She'd have to fight him. Trembling, she flourished the quill. In response, Mr. O'Cox spread his wings, then beat down hard with them upon the road. They threw up a cloud of dust. It was hard for Poppy to breathe, much less see. She took a step back, only to hear a sound behind her. Confused, she turned. Hidden by the dust, Mr. O'Cox had overleaped the road. Once again, he was behind her. From there, he made a slash at her with his beak. Poppy struck out with her quill. Seeing the quill and realizing the danger to his eyes, the owl pulled back. He glared at Poppy. He snapped his beak. Poppy stared back, grim-faced, gasping for breath, waving the quill before her. If it takes a whole night, I'll wear you down, Mr. O'Cox hissed. All it takes is one mistake on your part. Then you're done. Finished. He made a forward fent. Poppy danced nimbly back. Mr. O'Cox struck again. This time it was not with his beak, but with his talons. Poppy, quill up, dodged the talons with a quick sidestep, but she knew her only hope was to get into the corn and hide. Otherwise, the owl would overpower her. Making sure of her footing, she began to back toward the forest. Just as she had hoped, Mr. O'Cox leaped up and landed between her and the trees. It was then that she raced for the corn. Mr. O'Cox was just as fast, grasping her strategy. He barely touched earth when he took a flying hop forward to block her way. He advanced wildly now, snapping and snarling. In response, Poppy slashed wildly with her quill. Once she struck out at the owl's face, but only hit his feathers. But though the blow glanced off harmlessly, it served to infuriate him. Mr. O'Cox, closing in, darted his head in and out, side to side. Poppy was bewildered. Then the owl turned briefly away from her. In a flash, she made a successful rolling dive under his wing. She was behind Mr. O'Cox at last, on the corn side of the road. She started to run. He turned his head in a complete half circle, saw her, and spun his whole body about, his right wing extended full length. The wingtip struck Poppy a glancing blow to her head. Down she tumbled and landed on her back in the dust. Seizing his advantage, Mr. O'Cox pounced, beak open, tongue out, hissing. Poppy whipped the quill with the tongue. The tip of it pricked the owl's tongue. He screamed in rage and reeled back. Poppy had just enough time to regain her feet. Once more she faced him, quill at the ready. Mr. O'Cox, stung, pressed forward, now this way, now that, head bobbing, weaving, viciously snapping with his beak. Increasingly exhausted, Poppy was forced to give ground. She crumpled to her knees. It was the moment the owl had been waiting for. With a powerful kick, he thrust his left claw, talons spread, at Poppy's head. Poppy saw the claw coming. Using all of her strength to grip the quill, she held it up with both paws to protect herself and jabbed it into Mr. O'Cox's claw as it came down. The owl gave a great squawk, fell back, and began to roll about violently. Fearful of losing the quill, her only weapon, Poppy pulled on it with all her might, but the barbs had caught. She could not get the quill loose. She was being dragged and bumped along. Mr. O'Cox, screeching and flapping his wings wildly, flailed into the air. Before Poppy knew what was happening, she too was in the air. She did tell herself to let go of the quill, but by the time the thought was whole, it was too late. To drop from the height Mr. O'Cox had already reached meant a certain fall to certain death. There was nothing to do but hang on. Mr. O'Cox, squawking, hissing, flew like one possessed. Up, down, around he went, making loops and stalling dives, climbing and twisting, anything and everything to work the quill from his claw. But the more he flexed and twisted, the more the barbs worked themselves into his claw, causing ever more excruciating pain. Poppy hung on. The fact that Mr. O'Cox was dragging a claw, and from that claw dangled a mouse, greatly impeded his flying. His flight path became increasingly wild. In his desperate desire to rid himself of pain, Mr. O'Cox ceased to look where he was heading. Violently, he plunged toward the cornfield. Once over it, he lowered his left claw, and that meant Poppy, deliberately thumping it and her along the corn stalks in the hope that the quill would be jerked out. Poppy was being battered, but each time she decided to release her hold on the quill, the owl surged forward, causing her to cling to it more convulsively than before. Knowing she could not take much more, Poppy tried to see ahead. Mr. O'Cox was skimming low over the corn tops, but when he passed beyond them, he dropped toward the ground. Let go, Poppy told herself, let go. But she was feeling so groggy, her own muscles would not respond. Then she saw what the owl was aiming for, the salt lick, and he was picking up speed. In his madness, he was prepared to strike his claw on that. Poppy had wits enough to sense that if she struck the hard salt, it would be the end for her. Let go, she cried to herself again. This time she did. Down she plummeted. As she did, Mr. O'Cox first rose, then dropped, totally out of control. He slammed into the salt head. So great was the blow that the salt shattered while the owl went tumbling head over tail in an explosion of feathers. After 3 flips, he ignominiously flopped down like a sack of potatoes onto the ground. As for Poppy, she had landed on grass. For a moment she lay there stunned, battered, and confused. She looked up to the sky but saw nothing. Then she looked across the lawn. She saw him then. Mr. O'Cox lay on his back, perfectly still. His claws were drawn up over his chest, slightly curled. The quill still stuck out of the left one. Scattered about among the feathers were chunks of salt. Poppy stumbled to her feet. She took one wobbly step or two toward the cornfield. Then she stopped and looked back. Mr. O'Cox had not moved. She stared at him. Slowly, not sure if she should believe what she was thinking, she crept closer to the fearsome owl. After every few steps, she paused, looked, sniffed. Still there was no movement. Close to Mr. O'Cox's head now, Poppy stopped again. The owl's great eyes were wide open, staring up into the sky. His devil-like tufts of feathers were bent. His beak was open. As Poppy watched, it snapped listlessly. Mr. O'Cox? No answer. She took a step closer. Mr. O'Cox? His head turned slightly. For a moment, his eyes seemed to focus on her. Sometimes, he remembered, sometimes I wonder why I bother to protect you. With that, his beak made a final clack shut. His eyes closed. Poppy knew it then. Mr. O'Cox was no longer alive. Chapter 19, The Return. For a long time, Poppy gazed at the lifeless body of Mr. O'Cox. She thought she should be feeling triumphant joy. Plain gladness would have been good enough. Somewhere she did feel pride. But small as she was, it was buried deep. What Poppy felt was weariness, as if she had aged 4 seasons over the last hour. She felt old. Before her on the grass lay one of Mr. O'Cox's feathers. Poppy had never really looked at an owl's feather. This one was quite lovely. It was a mottled brown color with a white tuft on top, soft as any baby's breath. She picked it up in the breeze. The veins stirred slightly. With a sigh, Poppy slipped the feather into her sash. Then she turned and looked at the cornfield. At first she thought what she most desired was to lie down and sleep. It was growing dark. But a moment's thought made her realize sleep was impossible. What she needed to do was tell someone about her discoveries and what had happened. She crossed the dirt road and moved along the edge of the forest. There was enough of the porcupine's lingering scent for Poppy to find the trail that Aerith had used to go from his home to the field. For once, and it made her smile wanly, she was grateful for the old fellow's stink. Plunging directly into Dimwood Forest, Poppy traveled slowly, methodically, taking the time for proper precautions. Now and again, she paused to absorb the lush view, the way moonlight filtered through the fragrant air. A very tall tree, a particularly beautiful fern, a bush laden with blackberries as big as her head. When Poppy reached Aerith's log, she paused long enough to contemplate Mr. O'Cox's now abandoned snag. Who, she wondered, would live in it now? Aerith, she called into the log from the entry. Are you home, Aerith? In response, there was some scratching and snorting deep within. That you, Aerith? Who the snail's squirt is that? Came the growled reply. Can't a creature have any privacy around here? Beat it, unless you want to eat a quill sandwich. Aerith, it's me, Poppy. Who? Don't you remember? Poppy. Poppy, came the echo with more enthusiasm than before. A great rattling and shuffling could be heard. Then Aerith's grisly, flat face loomed out of the darkness. That really you, girl? Where is it? Where is what? The salt. Didn't you bring it? Aerith, it's about Mr. O'Cox. I don't give a flea flicks for that jerk of an owl. Where's the salt you promised me? It's there, by Newhouse, all broken up on the ground. On the ground? Aerith squeaked. What's it doing there? Aerith, I couldn't carry it. And besides, on the ground. Great snail, Swoggle. It'll melt to nothing. The porcupine came barreling by so fast Poppy had to leap aside. The next moment, he was all but running down the trail. Can I sleep here? Poppy called after him. Can't stop to talk, Aerith called back, and indeed, he was gone. Poppy stepped into the log, lay down, and was asleep at once. She slept until the sun was high. When she woke, Aerith had not yet returned, so she went out, found some seeds, ate them, returned to the log, and slept again until dusk. This time when she awoke, Aerith was there. He was chewing in a roisterous, slobbering way on a chunk of salt. Hello, Poppy said. Aerith didn't even look up. Delicious. Best salt I ever had. He licked his lips. Awesome. Then you got some of it? Some of it? All of it. I'm just about ossified. This is the last bit. It was all pure, wonderful salt. Absolutely delicious. Amazing. Divine. Aerith? What's that? Did you see Mr. O'Cox? Oh, yeah, him. Dead. What happened? Poppy told him. The porcupine, though busy with the salt, slowed his slobbering to listen. When Poppy finished her story, she asked Aerith, what do you think? Aerith shook his head. Never thought I'd appreciate that owl's hard head. But if what you say is true, it is. Well, I'm grateful he broke up this salt lick. Really, Poppy, it's incredible stuff. Want some? I mean, a small taste? Aerith, what's that? I'm going home now. May I come back and visit? Sure, Poppy, sure, anytime. And bring some salt. I'm going now. Poppy? What? You're the salt of the earth. Poppy crossed Glitter Creek by using the bridge. The rest of the way she traveled by the side of the tar road. By the time she reached Gray House, it was late. The first thing she noticed was that the red flag was flying. She climbed the porch steps slowly. Instead of going right inside, she took a peek. The entire family was gathered in the front parlor. Lugwort stood atop the old straw hat, apparently in the middle of a speech. And so, dear friends, we will have to break up the family. Yes, disperse, go our separate ways, forage on our own. There is insufficient food for us here. But first I wish to engage in a brief memorial tribute to our full family, which, Poppy, is that you, Poppy? She stepped inside. All the mice turned to stare. Poppy gazed at them evenly. Then she pulled the feather, Mr. O'Cox's feather, from her sash and held it aloft for all to see. Mr. O'Cox is dead, she said solemnly. And I can tell you that new house is right next to a big field of corn that has enough to feed us all forever and ever. Ah, Poppy, Lugwort cried triumphantly. Didn't I say that if you listened to my advice, all would be well? Chapter 20, last chapter. A new beginning. Almost 13 full moons to the night since Mr. O'Cox killed Ragweed. Poppy and her husband, Rye, how they met and married is another story, stood on Bannock Hill with their litter of 11 young mice. They had formed a circle around a small hazelnut tree. Looking on beneath a full golden moon was Aerith the porcupine. This tree, Poppy was saying to her rather restless children, was planted, after a fashion, by my late and dear friend Ragweed. Can't be sure that it was he who dropped the seed nut from which this tree has grown, but I would like to think so. Though it is rather frail now, some day this tree will be mighty. I want to affix this, here she held up a small earring, to a high branch, so as the tree grows, it will glitter in the sky for all of us to see. Hey, Ma does love making long speeches, or does she? Whispered one of the litter to one of her brothers. And here on Bannock Hill, Poppy went on, once forbidden to us, though we too live in Dimwood Forest, we shall have our dancing place. Does it matter how you dance, my children, slow or fast, by jumps or steps, as long as you are free to dance in the open air by the light of the moon, all will be well. Now, Aerith, if you please. Old Aerith, muttering mouse muck under his breath, gave a grunt, but began to shake and rattle his quills until he settled into a steady beat. Then the 11 young litter mice began to dance their own way, with jiggles and jumps and leaps and lopes. As for Poppy and Rye, they spun around and round in a stately waltz, dancing by the light of the moon and the earring which glittered high on the hazelnut tree. The end of Poppy. This first book in a series. There's more books. There's books about Ragweed. There's a book about Rye. Lots of books. Poppy's Return. Lots of books that you can read and enjoy. Next week, we're closed because it's Veterans Day, but 2 weeks from today, I will start reading a new book. If someone has a request of something to read, I will consider it. Otherwise, I have kind of an idea of what I might read next. Everybody have a wonderful afternoon and enjoy this nice, warmer weather that we're having right now. Bye.